with Pasquini Coffee Company. My name is Bezzera and Pasquini, and in this video we're going to show you how to rebuild the steam hot water wand on your Livia 90. For the Pasquini Livia 90, there are two versions of the steam hot water wands, either non-articulating and articulating. To start off, we will first have to identify which one you have on your machine. In this machine here, we see the example of the non-articulating steam wand. This steam wand only spins in a circle and is otherwise fixed in place. For the articulating steam wand, as shown on this machine, the steam wand moves in all directions and is attached via a ball and socket joint. Once you identify which machine you have, we'll go ahead and start the video at the appropriate point. We'll start off with the non-articulating rebuild instructions, but if you have an articulating machine, then skip to this part in the video. For rebuilding your non-articulating steam wand on your Livia 90, you're going to need a few things first. First thing you're going to need to do is purchase the rebuild kit on our website or in person at our store in Los Angeles. You can purchase the rebuild kit online at pasquini.com via the link below. The rebuild kit will include 2 O-rings for the actual steam wand, the seat gasket for the valve stem, and the O-ring for the valve stem. Do note that if you have not changed your valve stem in over a decade, we recommend to also pick up a valve stem replacement as well, as the metal on this does eventually wear out. So even with the new seals and gaskets, you can still have a leaking steam wand if this particular part is over 10 years old. Tools needed for the repair are going to be a flathead screwdriver, Phillips head screwdriver, adjustable crescent wrench, a size 16mm wrench, and preferably some kind of mechanic pick, either with a hook or L shape on the end of it. This tool isn't needed, but it makes it significantly easier to get the gaskets on and off of the steam wand and the valve stem. Before beginning any repair on any espresso machine from whatever manufacturer, make sure that the machine is unplugged, powered down, and cooled off. These pipes get incredibly hot and it's very easy to burn yourself if you do not allow for them to cool down sufficiently. Once your machine is unplugged and cooled, we can go ahead and start the repair. First thing you're going to want to do on your Livia 90 is to remove the top tray to get access to the steam wand. To do so, open the water tank lid, remove the slotted tray from the top, and remove the reservoir from the machine. On older machines, you'll have a wire here attached to it. This is your sensor wire. Just unplug that and make sure to plug it back in before putting your machine back together. One note is that if your reservoir tank is really stubborn and refuses to come out of the machine, an easy way to get it out is to take the top cover off of the machine, flip it around so you have this little metal hook, and hook it underneath the lip of the reservoir using the back of the machine as a pry bar, and simply push back and that will pop out the reservoir. Once the reservoir and top tray are removed, set them aside and use your Phillips screwdriver to remove the 2 screws on the left and right side of the machine. Once you have the screws loosened, make sure to put them in a safe place so they won't get lost. Worst case, replacements are available on pasquini.com. Once the screws are removed, lift the top tray off and set aside. Now we have access to the inside of the machine, but before we start touching anything in here, we have to remove the front knob from the machine. In order to do this, use your screwdriver or any other blunt instrument and push along the edge of the group cap here. And when you do so, it'll tilt it out so you can simply remove the picture cover from the machine. In order to prevent scoring on it or scratches, you can use a paper towel or rag to cover the tip of the screwdriver so that way you don't put the metal against the plastic and scratch it. Once you have the cap removed, use your flathead screwdriver and unscrew the retention nut from the front of the steam knob. Carefully remove the retention nut from the front of this steam wand, and also make sure not to lose the lock ring. You will need this to make sure that it does not slip when you put the machine back together. Put these both aside so they won't get lost. Once the lock ring and nut are removed, simply pull the knob off and it will just slide off, and now you have access to the retention nut behind the knob. In order to remove this nut, use your adjustable wrench and simply loosen. go ahead and set aside this so it doesn't get lost. In order to make this a little bit easier to remove, it's always good to take this out before trying to remove the valve body from the machine. Usually you can just unscrew it by hand, but if it is stubborn or tight, then you can go ahead and use your adjustable wrench to unscrew it this way as well. Once it's loose and screwed all the way, it simply pulls out and you can set this aside for later. Now once you have the front removed, we will loosen the nut back here in order to free the valve body from the machine. Using your 16mm wrench, loosen, and you can hold the bottom of the steam wand to brace it so it doesn't twist the pipe. Once you loosen the nut attached to the pipe, go ahead and slide it out of the way and slightly move the pipe out from the valve body, and then go ahead and pull the valve body back and pull the steam wand through the bottom of the machine. Now you have your entire steam assembly removed from the machine. Once you have the steam wand removed, take an adjustable wrench and simply loosen the steam wand nut from the bottom of the valve body. Once it's loose, unscrew it all the way and then pull the steam wand out and set aside. The first step we're going to do to rebuild this is to replace the gaskets on the valve stem. In order to do so, we're going to go ahead and use our mechanic pick seen here. First thing you want to do is remove the seat gasket from the back of the valve stem. If you're using a new valve stem, then there's no need to take any of this apart. Simply recycle the metal and you can assemble the new gasket from scratch. Otherwise, if you are going to reuse the existing one, take your pick, dig into the back here, and pry out the old worn out seat gasket. It doesn't matter if you destroy it because you're not going to reuse it. Just as I said in the beginning of the video, if this is over 10 years old, the metal can become quite brittle and frail. So as you see here, just removing that caused the end of this holder to crack, making this unusable. This is pretty common to happen on older parts like this. This particular part is about 20 years old. So that's why it's always good to have a spare one of these on hand if your machine is over a decade old. Go ahead and set this aside and we'll just use our new one for this particular rebuild. For the seat gasket, simply push the seat gasket into the opening until it sits flush with the end of the holder. If you get a little space here where it doesn't go all the way in, it means there's a little bit of air preventing it from going in all the way. So take your pick, push down on the side a little bit, and that'll allow you to push it all the way in and release the air so it doesn't get stuck, now letting it sit nice and flush against the back of the holder. To get this part on is a little bit tricky and requires some finesse. So take your pick, preferably one with a hook or an L shape to it, and stretch the O-ring around the valve stem until it seats into the channel. Once you have your O-ring on and your seat gasket in place, we'll move on to the steam wand gasket replacement. First thing to do is to remove the old O-rings from the steam wand. Once again, the mechanic pick will come in very handy for this by allowing you to hook underneath the gaskets and remove them from the steam wand. Once you remove the old gaskets, simply slide the new gaskets into place. Now that you have your new gaskets on, you can go ahead and reassemble the steam wand into the valve body. Push the steam wand into the valve body until it sits flush. Loosen the lock ring all the way to the top, and then slide the retention nut in place and tighten. This does not have to be super tight, so hand tight is okay, or give it a little turn on the wrench to secure it in place, but no need to do more than that. Once it's secured, use the retention nut, bring it all the way down, and lock it in place with a little turn on the wrench. Now that you have this reassembled, we can go ahead and put it back into the machine. Slide the steam wand back down and push the front of the valve body through the front of the machine, and then push the feed pipe back into the end of the valve body and begin to retighten the retention nut on this feed pipe. Bracing the steam wand on the bottom, use your 16mm wrench to retighten the nut until it is secure. Now that you have the valve body back in place, you can go ahead and reinsert the valve stem that you rebuilt with the new gaskets by pushing it into the valve body and then tightening it down. Once it's tightened down, take the retention nut, slide it back over, and tighten, securing the final few threads with the wrench. Now that that's back in place, take the steam wand knob, slide it back over the valve stem, and then using your lock ring and retention bolt, resecure the cap onto the machine. Now that your steam knob is back in place, you can put the top cap back over it, simply just by pushing it until it clicks, and begin to reassemble the machine, starting with the top tray, then putting your reservoir back in place, remembering to reattach the wire if your machine had a wire configuration. Once the top is back on, go ahead and line up the screw holes and refasten the top lid of the machine back down to the frame. Place the cup rack back on top of the machine, close the water lid, and congratulations, you finished rebuilding your non-articulating steam wand on your Livia 90. In this portion of the video, we're going to show you how to rebuild the articulating steam wand on your Livia 90. First thing to note on your articulating steam wand is if it uses the original black O-rings that came with the machine, or if it's already been upgraded to the new Teflon style O-rings. For the articulating steam wand, the black rubber O-rings have been discontinued and are no longer available. So if your machine uses black O-rings to secure the steam wand to the machine, you will have to get the upgrade kit, which includes the Teflon compatible nut and the 2 Teflon gaskets. Otherwise, if your machine is already equipped with the Teflon O-rings, then you can simply just buy the rebuild kit, which includes the O-rings and gaskets needed for a rebuild. Another option for the articulating steam wand is if you have the original style steam wand, you can upgrade to the new insulated cold touch steam wand, which is shown here. This steam wand comes with the Teflon retention nut and the Teflon gaskets needed for the repair. So you can go ahead and purchase this online if you like a nice substantial upgrade to your old style steam wand for your Livia 90. Once you have identified what kind of rebuild kit your machine needs, the rebuild kit can be purchased on pasquini.com. And again, as in the old other style steam wand, if this valve stem hasn't been replaced in over 10 years, it's a good idea to pick up a replacement valve stem as well before starting the repair. Tools needed to rebuild the articulating steam wand are the same as the non-articulating steam wand. So that is a Phillips screwdriver, flathead screwdriver, 16mm wrench, adjustable crescent wrench, and a mechanic pick. Once you have all the tools and parts needed, we can go ahead and begin the repair, making sure the machine is powered down, unplugged, and is cold. If the machine has been recently on, it will be very hot, so make sure to let the machine cool down sufficiently before beginning work, as it is easier to burn your hands on the internal pipework. In order to remove the top of the machine, open the reservoir lid, take the slotted tray off, remove the reservoir. If your machine has a wire, make sure to unplug the wire. If it doesn't, just simply pull out the reservoir and set aside. And if the reservoir is stubborn or refuses to come out, the same trick applies as before, where you can take the top slotted grate, hook it onto the back of the reservoir, and pry it to remove it from the housing. Set those aside and unscrew the 2 retention nuts on the top of the machine. Once you have the screws loosened, make sure to put them in a safe place so they won't get lost. Worst case, replacements are available on pasquini.com. Once the screws are removed, lift the top tray off and set aside. Once you have the top off your espresso machine, we can begin to disassemble the steam valve and valve body in order to replace the seals and gaskets. To start off, you'll go ahead and take your screwdriver or any blunt instrument. Usually we recommend to wrap a towel over the top of it to avoid scratching the plastic for the front cover, and simply press the screwdriver or instrument against any of the edges of the picture in order to pop out the plastic cover for the steam knob. Go ahead and set that aside so it doesn't get lost. And now using your flathead screwdriver, begin to unscrew the retention screw for the steam knob. Once the retention screw is removed, go ahead and set it aside and make sure to pay attention to the lock ring that is behind this retention screw. This lock ring is needed to prevent slipping when you reassemble the machine, so make sure it doesn't get lost. So go ahead and simply pull that off and set it aside. Then once you've removed the lock ring and retention screw, simply pull the knob forward in order to slide it off of the housing and place aside. So now you have access to the chrome lock ring that holds the valve body in place. In order to remove the lock ring, use your crescent wrench and simply just remove. Once you have the lock ring removed, unscrew the valve stem all the way in order to make it easier to get the valve body out of the machine. If it's hard to unscrew by hand, you can also use your crescent wrench on these flat sides here, like so, in order to remove the screw. Once it's loose enough, just pull it out and set this aside, as we'll get to this part later. Once you remove the valve stem from the valve body of the steam wand, it makes it easier to remove the valve body from the machine. So go ahead and set this aside, as we'll replace the seals and gaskets on this later. In order to remove the valve body from the machine, brace the valve body with the steam wand from the bottom and use your 16mm wrench to loosen the steam valve body retention nut that holds the feed pipe in place. Once the retention nut is loosened, pull the pipe out of the way, pull the valve body in through the machine, and then fish the steam wand out through the bottom of the machine. Once you have the valve body and steam wand removed from the machine, we can go ahead and remove the retention nut in order to rebuild the internals. However, on some machines with older gaskets, they can bind in place, making this extremely difficult to remove. If this cannot be simply removed by hand by bracing this side of your palm and unscrewing it with your crescent wrench, then you can use 2 crescent wrenches to brace this side a little more thoroughly and to get more torque onto removing this. Using a large crescent wrench, go ahead and tighten it against the side of the valve body and brace this in your hand here. Then take the other crescent wrench and tighten it in place to where it makes a little A shape in between the 2 wrenches. This allows you to actually squeeze the 2 wrenches together like a pair of scissors, getting more torque and being able to squeeze it to open and release the retention nut. Once it's loosened, simply just unscrew it by hand. With the articulating wand, this part is particularly important because there are 2 components in here that will attempt to fly away from you and get lost easily. So once you undo it, make sure to always keep tension and hold the 2 pieces together, as once you unscrew it, there will be a spring and a articulating cup inside this wand. You will reuse these. These typically do not wear out and can be used for years and years and years. So go ahead and set these aside so they do not get lost. If they become detached, this articulation cup has a concave side which goes against the ball valve, and it has a little cylinder side here that actually goes into the spring. So if they ever become disconnected, simply insert the cylinder portion back into the spring and set aside. Once you remove the steam wand from the valve body and set aside the spring and articulation cup, check to see what style gasket you have. If you have the Teflon gasket already installed, you can simply buy the rebuild kit that uses the 2 Teflon O-rings and the 2 rubber valve stem O-rings and seat gasket. If you, however, have a rubber gasket here, then you need to buy the upgrade kit in order to convert your machine from the rubber style seals and gaskets to the new Teflon style seals and gaskets. The upgrade kit is linked below by clicking here, and the standard rebuild kit, if you already have the Teflon gaskets, is linked here. Now, once you're ready to remove these, simply pull this one off and discard it, and you will have to remove this nut from the steam wand in order to remove the old Teflon insert or rubber insert. In order to get the rubber heat protector grip off, the best way to do this is to use a little bit of glass cleaner, typically Windex, and squirt some Windex inside of the rubber sleeve. Rotating it around, the Windex will loosen the grip on the steam wand so you can slide this off. If you try to slide it off without any lubrication, it will not budge. In order to free the rubber hand protector from the steam wand, simply pinch the edges a little bit so you make a small gap, and squirt a little bit of glass cleaner into the gap and rub it around. This will cause it to become loose and allow it to slide off of the steam wand without much hassle. There you go, set that aside for later, and we'll put that back on after we install the new O-rings. For the steam wand tip, this simply unscrews by hand. If this is more than hand tight, you can use a rubber grip pad or some kind of other holding device in order to unscrew it, but by and large it should be on hand tight at most times. A tip if you want to clean the steam tip is to soak it in kefisa and boiling water for about 10 to 15 minutes, and that will go ahead and clear any milk residue out of the steam tip. Now that you have your wand mostly disassembled, just go ahead and slide the retention nut all the way off of the wand. Once you have the steam wand removed from the retention nut, we have to dig out the old gasket. For the rubber gaskets, you can simply just use the pick here to dig out and remove the old gasket. For the Teflon style ones, use the rubber pin and just push it down so that it falls out the bottom. Now that you have your clean and emptied retention nut, you can insert the new gaskets. For the Teflon rebuild kit, this part is very important. The smaller O-ring that goes inside the retention nut is directional. While it's hard to tell from this video, one side is really thin and the other side is even thinner. In order to best see which side is the correct side, a little trick you can do is to use the valve stem, either the new one or an old one, and slide the Teflon O-ring down towards this first metal groove here. If it sits completely flush with it, that is the thicker side of the O-ring. If you flip it around, you'll see that it can slightly cup over the metal lip on the valve stem. This indicates that this is the slightly thinner side. Once you have it oriented this direction, so as you can see here, it slightly cups over the brass lip, as where if you use the thicker side, it cannot, it sits flush with the brass lip and doesn't cup over it. So make sure you have the thinner side facing down towards this piece. Once you have the thinner side in the correct orientation, take your lock ring and simply insert this all the way down to the bottom in order to properly seat the gasket in place. Once the gasket is properly seated, take your steam wand and reinsert it through the lock nut. Now that your gasket is inserted the correct orientation, you can begin to reassemble the steam wand onto the valve body. Take your larger Teflon O-ring from the rebuild kit, slide it on top of here, then take the actuation spring and actuation cup, place them this orientation so the spring goes inside the valve body and the articulation cup with the cup portion faces out. Go ahead and place the ball into the articulation cup, slide the retention nut down and begin to tighten. The spring will cause some resistance, but with a little bit of force you should be able to push it in place and begin to tighten it back down. Once it is nice and hand tight, go ahead and brace the valve body into your hand, use your crescent wrench and give it a little extra turn just to make sure it's secure. You don't have to go too tight with this, as the Teflon seals provide an excellent seal even with moderate tightness. Once it's tightened, we can go ahead and reassemble the rest of the steam wand. Take your heat protector again. If the Windex is already dried out, spray a little bit more on it to re-lubricate it, and this way it'll slide right back on. Go ahead and position it where you want it to be, and eventually the glass cleaner will evaporate and locking it in place. Take your steam tip and re-screw it back onto the steam wand. These instructions apply for all steam wands regardless of the type, so even if you have the old non-insulated steam wand, it still follows the same procedural instructions to put it back together. Once you have it reassembled, go ahead and reinsert it into the machine. Push the front screw through the front hole, get the steam feed pipe, line it back up with the back of the valve body, and loosely put the nut back on by hand. Once the steam wand nut is hand tight on the inside of the machine, go ahead and brace the steam wand in your hand and use your 16mm wrench to tighten it in place. Once again, you don't have to go too tight here. A little turn will do it, and the compression nut will lock into place. Once the steam wand and valve body are in place and tightened, we can go ahead and begin to rebuild the valve stem. As stated before in this video, if you have a valve stem that is over 10 years old, we highly recommend to replace it, as the brass will get brittle over time, causing this to potentially crack or making it so thin that even with new gaskets it'll still leak. If you're using your old one, just remove the O-ring from the valve stem and remove the seat gasket from the valve stem. This is where your mechanic pick will come in handy. Take the pick for the seat gasket, dig it into the seat gasket, and pry out. You're not going to reuse this gasket, so it's okay if you destroy it in the process, but once you pick it out, you should be able to remove it and go ahead and discard that. For the O-ring, you want to hook the pick underneath the O-ring and pry off and slide it off of this valve stem. Be careful not to jab yourself with a mechanic pick. Once you have the old seat gasket and O-ring removed, we can begin to install the new one. For the seat gasket, simply push it into the receptacle cup until it sits flush. If it does not sit flush all the way, there is some air trapped inside of it. In order to release the air, take your mechanic pick or a paper clip, dig it into the edge, and then push down. This little bit of tension on the edge will go ahead and release any air, allowing you to completely seat the seat gasket flush, so that way it's flush with the end of the valve and can create a proper seal. For the valve stem O-ring, slide it down the valve body and use your pick to stretch it over into the groove. Once it's seated in place, you can go ahead and reinsert the valve stem into the valve body of the machine. Simply push it into place and then begin to tighten it down until it bottoms out. Now that your rebuilt valve stem is reinserted, we can go ahead and put the retention nut and steam knob back onto the steam wand. Take your chrome retention nut and begin to tighten it down. And once it's hand tight, take your crescent wrench and just give it a little turn in order to firmly tighten it against the front of the machine. Once this is tightened, we can go ahead and reinsert the knob. So press the knob back into place. Use the lock ring and retention nut. So place the lock ring on first and then begin to tighten in place. We can leave this part of the struggle in the video and just be like, tech struggling to insert flathead screwdriver. And then put like underneath, flathead screwdriver should be illegal. Once you've reassembled your steam knob, go ahead and place the icon cover back in and it clicks in place. Now that you've fully reassembled your steam wand and rebuilt the internals, you can place the cover back onto the machine. Start with the top cap, make sure it's lined up correctly. Center the holes over the screws and begin to tighten down. Now Now that you've attached the top lid back to the machine, go ahead and reinsert your reservoir. Remember, if it had a wire attached to the side of it, to reinsert that before placing it into the machine, or else the machine won't turn back on. Sink the reservoir back down, place the cup rack back on, close the lid, and congratulations, you have fully rebuilt the articulating steam wand on your Livia 90. Do note that while this video only showed the steam wand for both the articulating and non-articulating, the water wand is the identical build to the steam wand, so therefore the instructions provided for the steam wand also apply to the water wand, with the only difference being the shaping of the wand, but the attachment points, seals, and gaskets needed are identical between both sides. Thank you for watching. To see more Pasquini Tech Tip videos and to see more information about our products, click the subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos, and visit www.pasquini.com for more information and details.